Imagine it's 7th of March, 2023. You're a 68-year-old retired public servant living in Los Teques, Venezuela. Your apartment is small, clean, and dim, with a fan that clicks every few seconds, and a plastic table where the bills are sorted into two careful piles. One pile is bolivars, the money of your country. The other is US dollars, the money your two daughters sent from Spain. These dollars are about $150 a month, folded so many times the corners have gone soft. You rent out a room when you can, boil water for coffee before sunrise, and walk to the market with a notebook because memory is no longer enough. Some days you can choose between medicine and lunch, but never both with any comfort. If you have ever wondered how a family survives when a whole country starts coming apart, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. By the time you reach the market, the numbers have changed again. The eggs cost more than they did last week. Corn flour costs more. Cheese costs more. The dollars from your daughters still arrive, but the ground under them is moving too. That woman was Carmen Mendoza, a real Venezuelan retiree Reuters interviewed in Los Teques in March 2023, and her life captures something important about collapse. It does not always arrive as one loud explosion. Sometimes it arrives like seawater through a cracked wall, one cold line at a time. This continues until the whole house smells of salt. First, the salary stops making sense, then the pension, then the savings, then the routine. And finally, the future itself starts to feel like a luxury item. This is the story of how one family survived Venezuela's collapse step by step. Not by getting rich, not by seeing the future perfectly, not by making heroic speeches. They survived by adapting faster than the system was failing. And that is why this matters. Because history shows that when a country breaks financially, the people who endure are usually not the strongest. They are not the smartest in some grand way. They are the ones who notice what kind of storm it really is. A fire asks you to run. A flood asks you to climb. A currency collapse asks you to stop trusting the floor while it still looks solid. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Venezuela did not collapse because one bad week hit an unlucky country. The roots were older and deeper. For decades, Venezuela lived as a petrostate, which means a country built around oil money. That can feel wonderful for a while. Oil dollars come in. The state spends freely, imports stay cheap. People begin to think the machine can run forever. But a petrostate can become like a family living on one giant paycheck while using a credit card. As long as the paycheck stays huge, the weakness stays hidden. When the paycheck shrinks, every lie in the house becomes visible at once. In Venezuela, the government leaned hard on oil, price controls, currency controls, and money creation. Price controls mean politicians try to force prices low by decree, like telling a thermometer to show cooler weather. Currency controls mean the state decides who gets scarce foreign money and who does not. And money creation, when used recklessly, is the oldest trick in a failing book. It is like adding water to soup when guests keep arriving. The pot looks fuller. The meal gets thinner. After global oil prices crashed in 2014, the state could no longer feed the promises it had made. The government kept spending, printed more money, strangled business with controls, and watched production fall. The Council on Foreign Relations and other researchers have pointed to the same chain again and again. This chain includes dependence on oil, destruction of productive capacity, political centralization, and then the shock. Later sanctions worsened the pain, but the beams were already rotting before the storm hit. And once you see that, the rest of the story becomes easier to understand. This brings us directly to the first part of survival. In a collapse like this, the first thing to die is not always food. It is measurement. Money stops measuring reality. And when the ruler bends, every plan drawn with it bends too. Venezuela reached that stage in brutal fashion. In July 2018, the IMF said inflation was on track to hit 1,000%. They compared the country to Germany in 1923 and Zimbabwe in the late 2000s. Later, IMF reporting put the 2018 figure even higher, around 1,370,000%, while Venezuela's own central bank said 130,060%. The exact number matters less than the meaning. Prices were not just rising, they were attacking the idea of planning itself. In 2018, opposition lawmakers were already reporting daily price jumps that turned a monthly budget into a joke. By 2023, Reuters reported that the average monthly private sector salary was about $139. Public sector pay was around $14, and a basic family grocery basket cost about $370. Think about what that means. The ladder was still standing. It just no longer reached the roof. Ordinary people felt this in tiny humiliations. Moises Hernandez, a cleaner in San Antonio del Táchira, told Reuters he had to cross into Colombia. Unless he crossed into Colombia to buy food he could not eat. Lila Mateus in Maracaibo said everything was for sale in dollars. Small dollar bills were hard to find. Omaira Rodriguez, a retiree in Petare, said her pensioner could buy only a bag of laundry soap. Carmen Mendoza in Los Teques said even access to dollars was no longer enough. Yaslin Garcia, a 32-year-old mother of 4, said $20 a week that once covered groceries was now buying little more than eggs. The $20 bought corn flour, some grains, and cheese. Markets had food. That was the cruel part. The shelves were not always empty. The people were. Now here's where it gets interesting. Families who survived this first stage did something simple, but emotionally very hard. They stopped treating the national currency as the center of their world before the state officially admitted it was broken. They shortened their time horizon. They stopped thinking in months and started thinking in days. They counted value in bags of rice, bus fare, antibiotics, diapers, or dollars from a relative abroad. This was not greed, it was translation. They were translating life out of a language the state kept debasing. Debasing means cheapening until it loses meaning. Look at Carmen's family. Her daughters had left for Spain. That itself was part of the survival strategy, though no family chooses it lightly. One branch of the tree went abroad so the trunk could live. Carmen had a pension, rental income, and remittances. Remittances are money sent home by relatives abroad. None of those streams was enough alone. Together they formed a patchwork raft. That is how many Venezuelans survived. Not on one solid bridge, but on several weak boards tied together. In the same period, Reuters reported that more than 4 million Venezuelans had fled by mid-2019. All but about 700,000 of them left after the end of 2015. Migration was not a side effect. It became part of the household balance sheet. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The winners in this stage were not always people with high incomes. Often they were people with a line out of the system, a cousin in Bogota, a son in Madrid, a friend who could accept dollars, a room to rent, a motorcycle to deliver food, a way to cross a border. In a stable country, that sounds informal, even messy. In a collapse, informality becomes oxygen. The official economy turns into a painted door on a brick wall. The unofficial one becomes the hallway behind it. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. If your bank balance looked healthy, but you could not withdraw it, would you call it savings? If you could not spend it or protect its value, what would it be? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what I am about to show you next is the part of the story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. This leads to the second part of the story. When money fails, people run to the bank. But when trust fails, the bank itself becomes part of the danger. Argentina gave one of the clearest examples. At the end of 2001, after years of recession and growing panic, the government imposed the corralito. The word means little corral, like a small pen used to trap animals. It was a cruelly perfect name. The state froze roughly $40 billion in deposits and capped cash withdrawals. From late 2001 through 2002, ordinary Argentines discovered that having money in the system and having access to it were not the same thing. Riots broke out, ATMs were vandalized, supermarkets were looted. Reuters later described how millions of middle-class Argentines were pushed into poverty. Notice the pattern. In Venezuela, people learned that money in bolivars was melting. In Argentina, people learned that money in the bank could be locked away. Different mechanism, same result. The household loses control over time. A family budget is really a map of future choices. School fees next month, rent next week, medicine tomorrow. When the bank gate closes, the future shrinks to the cash in your pocket. Reuters spoke in 2019 to Argentines who still kept savings at home because the memory never left. A 70-year-old woman named Stella said she preferred to have her savings in her house because she already had experience with corralitos. That sentence tells you everything. Once the state breaks the basic promise of access, trust does not bounce back like a rubber ball. It cracks like ceramic. You can glue it. You can paint it. It still remembers the fracture. Why does this matter for our Venezuelan family? Because collapse changes what counts as safety. Before a crisis, safety often means obeying the official script. Keep money in the bank, save in the national currency. Follow the rules. During a crisis, those habits can become traps. In Venezuela, bank lines and blackouts made access itself uncertain. During the huge blackout of March 2019, Reuters reported that bakeries and pharmacies demanded cash, and for many that meant foreign cash. Imagine the cruelty of that moment. Your debit card exists, your account exists, but the lights are out and the bakery wants dollars. It is like owning a key while the entire building has been dropped into the sea. Argentina's case shows another hard truth. The middle class is often hit first, not because it is weakest, but because it trusts the structure the longest. Poorer households may already live partly outside formal systems. Very rich households often have lawyers, foreign accounts, and property. The middle class keeps the paper trail. It has salaries, pensions, savings accounts, maybe a small shop, or tuition to pay. It stands on the bridge because the bridge existed yesterday. Then the bridge opens under its feet. Look at what happened next. Even long after the Argentine crisis had passed, Reuters found savers pulling deposits whenever political fear returned. That is another lesson collapse teaches. Survival is not only about what you do during the event. It is about what memory does to you after. Once a family has watched a government seize time, they do not forget. They learn to spread risk. They learn that one institution can fail. They learn that confidence is not an asset, it is a mood. The third part of this story takes us to Zimbabwe, because this is where the pattern becomes almost impossible to deny. If Argentina shows when access to money is trapped, Zimbabwe shows when the money itself becomes a joke told with a straight face. In September 2008, Reuters reported that Zimbabwe's annual inflation hit 231 million% in July. A loaf of bread that cost 500 Zimbabwe dollars on August 1st was soon selling for at least 7,000. Monthly prices were rising by 2,600%. People resorted to barter, swapping goods directly because money no longer works. Families relied on relatives in South Africa for maize, sugar, and cooking oil. One meal a day became normal for millions. A country can look intact on a map while daily life inside it turns medieval. A decade later, Reuters described how hyperinflation peaked at 500 billion% in 2008, wiping out pensions and savings. It wiped out what it called any vestiges of confidence in the currency. Vestiges means the last little scraps left behind. In these collapses, confidence dies in stages. First people complain, then they adapt, then they laugh at the money. And when a society starts laughing at its own currency, the funeral is already underway. This is why Venezuela's story is larger than Venezuela. When the IMF compared Venezuela to Zimbabwe, it was not chasing drama. It was pointing to a known mechanism. Governments print to fill holes, prices sprint ahead, real production falls. The government prints more. The cycle feeds on itself like a machine chewing through its own wiring. What looks like more money is really less value spread across more paper. This produces strange scenes that outsiders misunderstand. They see photos of giant stacks of banknotes and think people must be rich. The opposite is true. In hyperinflation, cash becomes confetti with a national seal. During Zimbabwe's collapse, families tried to spend money as soon as they got it. During Venezuela's collapse, families shifted into goods, dollars, or anything harder than bolivars. Payday stops being a moment of relief and becomes a race against evaporation. And yet, some people survived better than others, not because they were protected from pain, but because they moved faster than the currency. Zimbabweans, with access to foreign money, trade goods, or relatives abroad, had a better chance. The same mechanism worked in different countries across different decades with the same result. When official money turns liquid, households start looking for stones to stand on. Most people will never know what you now know. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Venezuela, Argentina, and Zimbabwe did not fail in exactly the same order. One crushed people through hyperinflation, another through deposit controls, another through a currency death spiral. But the core mechanism was the same. The state made promises it could no longer fund and push the cost onto ordinary households. In each case, the first public signal was confusing: a frozen account, a new exchange rule, a missing product. But underneath those small shocks was a bigger truth. The official system was no longer a machine for organizing trust. It had become a machine for rationing pain. That is the secret key. Collapse is not random weather. It is a transfer. Time, purchasing power, and freedom are transferred away from households and toward people who can move or exit. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In stable times, institutions act like bridges. In unstable times, they are traps. People are still using the same names for things: salary, pension, deposit, money. But the substance inside those names has changed. It is like biting into a fruit that still looks fresh and finding the inside gone brown. Collapse does not always look equally bad for everyone at the same moment. Sometimes it creates pockets of apparent recovery. In Venezuela, de facto dollarization brought some relief after 2019. Shops could price goods more clearly. But in 2022, inflation was still 222%. Most private sector salaries were in dollars, while public workers earned in bolivars. The shift made commerce possible, but also widened the gap between those inside the dollar stream and those outside it. This brings us directly to the human cost. Statistics can hide the real wound of an economy, contracting by 75%. Families heard something else. They heard meals disappearing, schools thinning out, children leaving, and old people counting coins for medicine. The groups hit hardest are usually the ones who did what they were told: pensioners, teachers, nurses, small shop owners, people with fixed wages and visible savings. Nurse Sayer Chacon said her salary was not enough even to change the oil in her car. Ramona Franco said her 19 years of teaching earned her $15 a month. That is not enough to buy a kilo of cheese. Pensioner Elise Moreno said after 35 years, he felt he had gone from middle class to asking for alms. That is what collapse does. It does not merely reduce income. It humiliates biography. It turns a lifetime of work into a bad coupon. You see the same wound in Greece. In 2015, the government shut banks and imposed a €60 daily cash withdrawal limit. People pulled billions from their accounts before the controls came in. The fear was not abstract. It was breakfast and rent money. Reuters noted that withdrawal controls imposed in 2015 were only removed 3 years later. A crisis can be an aftershock machine for years. Cyprus gave a colder lesson in 2013. Deposits above €100,000 faced a bail-in of 47.5%. Bail-in is a polite term for savers paying for the bank rescue from inside the building. Lebanon repeated this after 2019. Over $100 billion remained trapped in Lebanese banks, leaving ordinary savers to struggle for retirement and healthcare funds. Some depositors even held up banks to demand their own savings back. The middle layers of society were squeezed hardest. Who walked away better? Usually people with foreign currency income, mobile businesses, hard assets, or overseas ties. Collapse is a funnel. It narrows choices for most people and widens them for a small minority. Look closer at the family level. Seamstress Maria Teresa Jimenez watched 5 of her children and 9 grandchildren leave Venezuela. Another grandmother was caring for 3 granddaughters after her daughter went to Colombia to find work. School registration required ID photos that cost more than a quarter of the average monthly salary. The doorway to life has an exit fee. In 2019, Frances Rivero feared for the life of her baby because he was not gaining weight. Public help was unavailable. Only after money from siblings abroad could she buy formula and stabilize him. Another mother said her family went 2 days without eating. Collapse is not just an economic event. It is a theft of rhythm. Breakfast disappears first, then certainty, then childhood. Even the social fabric thins. Father Cristobal Dominguez lost the entire youth choir of his parish because the young adults migrated. His church ran a soup kitchen feeding more than 500 people a week. The choir leaves. The soup line grows. These are not stories about speculation. They are stories about responsible people discovering the system has turned predatory. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The question is if you will see it coming. So what did the survivors do? Ordinary survivors shared 3 characteristics. First, they did not depend on a single pipe for value. 1 salary, 1 bank, 1 currency. That arrangement is dangerous in bad times. Survival looks less like a fortress and more like a fishing net. Second, survivors adjusted their behavior before the authorities adjusted their language. They did not wait for an official speech. They noticed when shops asked for dollars or when salaries lagged. They were willing to insult themselves with the truth. Third, survivors treated relationships as economic infrastructure. Family, trust, and neighborhood networks became as important as wages. In Zimbabwe, families leaned on relatives in South Africa. In Argentina, memory of bank safety became a generational inheritance. In stable times, relationships are wallpaper. In unstable times, they are the load-bearing walls. Survivors also stayed useful. They kept some skill, room, or asset that could still be exchanged when the official script failed. A title on paper can vanish overnight. A skill that solves somebody's problem at noon still has value by evening. None of this is romantic. We should not pretend collapse creates noble simplicity. It creates stress, separation, and grief. The Venezuelan family in this story survived, but survival had a price. Daughters left. Children grew up hungry. 1 in 3 children needed humanitarian assistance by 2019. A country does not come through numbers like that unchanged. So bring this back to Carmen Mendoza. Her family did not beat the system. They outlived each month. She learned that a pension could become symbolic and a market could be full and still unaffordable. First, the currency breaks, then the old budget breaks, then the family reorganizes itself across borders, jobs, and currencies. History shows that national collapse is rarely one event. It is a sequence. A bank that no longer reassures. A shelf that no longer tells the truth. Families that endure usually stop believing in the official map before they stop loving their country. They update their reality. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.